Welcome to the sleep hours, the only place where cartoons fall asleep before you do. So grab your blanket, tuck in your favorite plushie, and let's get weird. Tonight's story drifts into the world of Squidward Tentacles, the grumpy yet oddly lovable neighbor from Bikini Bottom. After a long day, Squidward finally seeks peace and quiet in his home, where his evening unfolds with humor, nostalgia, and an unexpectedly cozy calm. Settle in, get comfortable, and let Squidward's quiet night guide you into a restful sleep. It was a quiet evening in Bikini Bottom, or at least as quiet as the ocean floor could manage. For once, there were no muffled shouts of "I'm ready" bouncing through the neighborhood, and no maniacal laughter from Patrick echoing in the distance. The street outside Squidward's Easter Island head-shaped home was still calm, almost serene. Inside, Squidward Tentacles stood in the center of his living room, arms crossed, beak curled into a smug little grin. "Finally," he muttered to himself, the sound of his own voice bouncing off the walls. "A night of peace. A night of quiet. Something this town clearly knows nothing about." He wandered around the room, savoring the silence like a fine meal. The carpet gave a soft squish under his suction-cupped feet as he strolled, his clarinet resting nearby on its stand like a loyal companion. Normally, Squidward would be pulling at what little hair he had left by this hour, after hours of SpongeBob's laughter drilling to his eardrums. But tonight was his night. Of course, being Squidward, he couldn't just accept this rare gift of silence without comment. As he sat down in his favorite chair, the cushions sighing beneath him, and said dramatically, "Imagine a whole evening with no interruptions, no silly songs, no jellyfishing accidents crashing into my windows. Just me, my clarinet, and tranquility." He stretched the word out, closing his eyes as if the mere sound of it could wrap him in a blanket. For a moment he allowed himself to believe it. The lamp in the corner glowed softly, casting a warm golden hue over the room. The bubbles outside drifted lazily, creating tiny, twinkling reflections on his window. Squidward breathed in deeply, then exhaled through his nose with a long sigh of contentment. Then, just as he was sinking into this picture of perfection, he noticed at the faint drip of his kitchen sink. His eyes snapped open, and his forehead wrinkled. "Really? Out of all nights?" He stomped toward the kitchen, each step producing a comical little suction pop sound on the tile floor. Standing before the sink, he twisted the faucet with his tentacle until it squeaked to a stop. The dripping ceased. Squidward smirked, satisfied. "There. Problem solved." He strutted back toward the living room, only to hear the faint creak of his chair as it settled. His eyes narrowed. Of course. Can't have anything perfect. But when he sat down again, the creak faded into nothing, replaced by the soft, bubbling sound of the ocean currents outside. Squidward leaned back, adjusting himself, his tentacles tucked neatly. He tried to hold on to his grumpy attitude. After all, Squidward Tentacles never allowed himself to appear too pleased with anything. Yet the sounds around him weren't the loud, chaotic noises he despised. They were gentle. The bubbling currents, the occasional rustle of water brushing past his house, even the faint hum from his lamp, it was all surprisingly soothing. He muttered, closing his eyes again. "Not bad. Not the complete silence I deserve, but acceptable." He reached for his clarinet and cradled it like a prized possession. Tonight he wasn't going to blast out dramatic solos that startled the neighborhood. No, tonight was just for him. Slowly, softly, he lifted it to his beak and played a long, quiet note. The sound lingered in the room, smooth and mellow, mixing with the gentle noises of the night. For once the music didn't feel forced or strained by his constant desire for perfection. It felt natural, almost like a lullaby to himself. When the last note faded, Squidward chuckled under his breath. Ha! If SpongeBob could hear this, he'd probably call it pretty or some nonsense. Luckily, he's not here to ruin it. The thought made him smile, a small, rare smile that appeared only when he knew no one was watching. He set the clarinet down and reached for the steaming cup of kelp tea he had prepared earlier. The warmth seeped into his tentacle as he lifted it, the soft steam fogging his glasses briefly as he sipped. The taste was earthy, calming, and paired perfectly with the gentle sounds of his home. Outside, the sea seemed to settle further into its nighttime rhythm. The distant glow of bioluminescent plankton drifted past, painting the water outside his window in flickers of blue and green. Squidward gazed at it, unimpressed on the surface, but deep down, something about the scene tugged at him, a reminder that quiet beauty did exist, even here in Bikini Bottom. This, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, is how life should be. And with that, he leaned back into his chair, allowing the soft hum of the night to carry him deeper into his long-awaited quiet evening. Squidward's chair gave a soft thwump as he adjusted his weight, the fabric puffing out a tired sigh. He rested his teacup on the little table beside him and draped his tentacles neatly across the armrests. His eyelids fluttered, heavy but not quite ready to close. No tonight was too special to waste on sleep just yet. This was a night to savor. His gaze drifted upward, tracing the smooth, domed ceiling of his home. The lamplight pooled in warm circles, reminding him vaguely of being on stage, a spotlight over his head. He imagined himself playing a solo in some fancy concert hall, the crowd sitting in perfect silence, every eye fixed on him. Not a squeaky laugh, not a camera flash, not SpongeBob waving from the front row with his goofy grin, just quiet, respectful admiration. Now that's a thought, he murmured, the corners of his beak twitching upward. But then, just as quickly, his daydream fizzled, replaced with the reality of his empty living room. Squidward sighed, long and heavy, sinking further into the cushion. Of course, even in my own imagination, I can't hold on to peace for more than a minute. He tapped his tentacles against the chair's arm and leaned forward and picked up his clarinet again. This time, he didn't play anything rehearsed or dramatic. Instead, he let his tentacles move without thought, coaxing out a gentle string of notes. The melody wandered like the current itself, soft, almost hesitant. It wasn't perfect. Squidward never thought his playing was perfect, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The sound filled the room like a warm blanket. When he paused, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt complete, whole. Outside, the ocean seemed to echo him. A small school of glowing fish floated past his window, tiny golden dots gliding in formation. Their light twinkled across the glass and danced on the walls, painting everything in soft, moving patterns. Squidward's eyes lingered on them, his expression calm but thoughtful. Even the fish have better audiences than I do, he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He set the clarinet aside once more and leaned back, tilting his head to the side. The gentle gurgle of bubbles outside blended with the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. It was the kind of background noise most people ignored, but Squidward heard it clearly. He always noticed the little things. Sometimes they irritated him. But tonight they all blended together like instruments in an orchestra, and for once, Squidward was the conductor. He closed his eyes and folded his tentacles in his lap, breathing in slow, measured rhythms. His body sank deeper into the chair until it almost felt like he was floating. The cushion cradled him like a cloud, and the warmth from the lamp seemed to melt into his skin. A small smile flickered across his face, again fleeting, but genuine. In the quiet of the room, Squidward's thoughts began to wander. Not the usual angry rants about SpongeBob's antics, not the endless list of complaints he recited daily. No, his mind went somewhere softer. He remembered long ago when he was younger, sitting by himself in a quiet corner of his childhood home, practicing the clarinet for hours. Back then, the silence wasn't just a preference. It was his closest companion. He hummed softly, almost without realizing it. The sound low and steady. It felt safe. Then, out of nowhere, a tiny creak echoed from the hallway. Squidward's eyes shot open, and he stiffened. His head turned sharply toward the sound, his heart giving one annoyed thump. "Who's there?" he called, his voice just a little higher pitched than usual. Of course, there was no answer, just the bubbling of the ocean outside and the faint tick of the clock. Squidward's gaze narrowed and he rubbed his temples. "Oh, great. Now I'm hearing things. What's next? SpongeBob popping out of my closet?" Still he rose from his chair, suction cups making sticky little pops as he crossed the living room. His steps echoed softly in the otherwise still house. He peeked into the hallway, empty. He peeked into the bathroom, nothing but a towel drooping sadly on the rack. Finally, with a dramatic huff, he crossed his arms. "See? Nothing. Just my imagination." Squidward marched back into the living room, sat down in his chair again, and muttered, "Even my own mind won't let me enjoy a quiet night. Typical." Yet the faintest chuckle slipped from his beak. He shook his head, his annoyance already softening. Maybe, just maybe, the creak had been nothing more than his old house settling. And if not, well, at least it gave him one more excuse to appreciate the fact that SpongeBob wasn't here. He leaned back once more, nestling himself deeper into the chair. The night resumed its calm rhythm, as though nothing had ever interrupted it at all. The chair's cushions welcomed Squidward once more with a muffled sigh, and he let his body sink into them as though he'd been away for hours instead of minutes. He grabbed his teacup again and took a careful sip. The warmth slid down his throat, spreading through him like sunlight seeping into the ocean floor. "Ah," he breathed, setting the cup back onto the table with deliberate grace. He tapped the rim lightly with one finger, the faint ting echoing in the stillness. The silence hung heavy in the room, but not in a way that pressed down on him. It surrounded him like an old quilt, faded, a little worn, but comforting. Squidward glanced at the clock. Only a few minutes had passed since he'd first sat down, yet it felt as though the whole day had drained from his body and left him lighter than ever. A slow grin tugged at his mouth, almost mischievous. If only SpongeBob could see me now. No chaos, no interruptions, just tranquility. He'd probably burst into tears from boredom. He chuckled at his own joke, the sound muffled and soft, but undeniably real. For Squidward, that counted as a victory. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes again. His breathing steadied, and his thoughts began to wander once more. This time, they didn't drag him back into childhood or fill him with complaints. Instead, they simply drifted like little bubbles rising lazily to the surface. He thought about his clarinet. He thought about his paintings. He thought about the ocean currents outside his window, moving without a care. And then, surprisingly, he thought about nothing. It startled him a little, realizing his mind wasn't chewing on grievances or stewing in irritation. It was simply quiet. The same kind of quiet he'd always craved but rarely ever found. For a moment, he opened one eye and looked around the room, almost suspiciously. "This is too good to be true," he muttered. "Something bound to ruin it." But nothing did. No SpongeBob, no Patrick. No noisy reef blowers or marching bands or Krusty Krab emergencies. Just Squidward, his chair, his lamp, and the hush of the sea outside. The weight of that realization pressed into him, not heavily, but like a hand resting on his shoulder, firm, reassuring. He wasn't sure if he liked it. He wasn't used to quiet that lasted. Usually it came in short, stolen bursts before the chaos returned. Tonight, though, it lingered. His gaze drifted to the window again. The glowing fish from earlier had gone, leaving only the endless darkness of the ocean and the faint shimmer of plankton. Squidward found himself staring at the nothingness outside, mesmerized. The soft, slow movement of the water gave the illusion of clouds drifting lazily across a midnight sky. He blinked, and for a second he imagined he was above the surface, staring at the stars instead of the sea. His voice was quieter now, less sharp, more contemplative. Maybe quiet isn't so bad after all. The lamp hummed faintly, its light steady but warm. Squidward adjusted his position in the chair, curling one tentacle beneath his chin like a pillow. His eyes closed again, but this time it wasn't out of irritation or fatigue. It was a choice. He wanted to rest in this moment, to hold on to it as long as possible. His clarinet sat on the table beside him, the wood gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He considered picking it up again, maybe playing something soft to accompany the rhythm of the night. But no, not yet. For once, silence was the perfect song. He breathed deeply, the sound slow and deliberate, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The house seemed to follow his lead. Even the clock's ticking softened, blending seamlessly with the gentle pulse of the ocean. It was almost like the world outside had agreed to leave him alone. Almost. A faint pop echoed from the kitchen, just a bubble rising from the sink's pipes, most likely. But Squidward's eyes snapped open anyway, his body stiffening. He glanced toward the hallway, waiting. Nothing followed. He exhaled through his nose, long and sharp. Honestly, you'd think a man could get through one evening without his own plumbing trying to sabotage him. Still, he didn't get up this time. He stayed in his chair, lips pressed into a thin line before they softened into something halfway between annoyance and amusement. Oh, who am I kidding? If the worst interruption tonight is a bubble, then maybe I really am lucky. His eyes drifted closed again, the faintest smile lingering on his face. The night wrapped itself around him once more, quiet, steady, and utterly his. Squidward stirred in his chair, one tentacle reaching lazily for his teacup. He lifted it, took a careful sip, and smacked his lips with the satisfaction. The tea had cooled slightly, the sharp heat mellowed into something soothing. He let the cup rest against his chest for a moment, feeling the faint warmth seep into him. This, he whispered to himself, is exactly what I deserve. The words hung in the room, and he realized how rarely he actually heard his own voice when it wasn't dripping with sarcasm or raised in irritation. It sounded softer, lower, almost vulnerable in the quiet. The sound made him straighten a little, as though caught doing something embarrassing, even though no one was there to hear. He reached over and set the teacup down gently. His eyes flicked toward the clarinet again. It seemed to glow under the lamplight, like it was waiting patiently for him. He hesitated, tapping his fingers on the armrest. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he picked it up. The wood felt cool and familiar in his hands. Squidward lifted it to his beak and blew a long, low note. It wasn't loud or showy, just a single, steady sound that wavered slightly at the edges. The vibration filled the room, blending with the ocean's hum outside. He closed his eyes and played another note, then another, stringing them together in a meandering tune. It wasn't one of his usual dramatic concert pieces or tortured compositions. This was softer, quieter, almost like a lullaby he hadn't realized was hiding inside him. The clarinet sang gently, the notes weaving into the silence rather than breaking it apart. Squidward swayed slightly in his chair, eyes half-lidded as he lost himself in the sound. The melody drifted like seaweed in the current, simple and repetitive, but soothing. For once, he didn't care if anyone else thought it was good. He didn't care if SpongeBob was outside giggling about squiddy music, or if the world was too busy to notice. The only audience tonight was himself, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The song tapered off into a final lingering note. Squidward lowered the clarinet, his tentacles resting lightly on the keys. He exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. "Well," he muttered, "that wasn't half bad." He leaned back again, placing the clarinet carefully on the table. The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, like the music still lingered in the walls, echoing softly. He folded his arms behind his head, his eyelids heavy. Outside the window, a jellyfish drifted lazily past, its body glowing faintly in the dark. Squidward watched it without moving, his eyes tracing the slow, rhythmic pulsing of its body. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way it floated without hurry, as though it had all the time in the world. He sighed, not unhappily, but with a strange mixture of envy and contentment. "Must be nice," he murmured. "No responsibilities, no noisy neighbors, just floating." The jellyfish drifted out of sight, leaving Squidward staring at the empty blue-black water. His gaze lingered there, unfocused, until the lamp's warm glow tugged him back. He shifted in his chair, pulling a blanket over himself. The fabric was thin and a little scratchy, but in that moment, it felt perfect. The minutes passed quietly, the clock ticking in steady rhythm. Squidward's breathing slowed, his body sinking deeper into the chair. For once, his thoughts weren't racing or picking fights with themselves. They moved sluggishly, like waves lapping lazily against the shore. It struck him again how strange this was to be so at peace. He wasn't used to it. Normally, peace was something he chased but never caught. Tonight, it had simply walked in and sat beside him. A faint smile tugged at his mouth again, softer this time. He didn't fight it. The lamp flickered once, briefly, then steadied. Squidward's eyes narrowed, but the warmth of the light reassured him. It wasn't an omen or a sign of impending disaster, just the lamp reminding him it was there. He let his head sink back against the chair. His eyelids fluttered heavier and heavier with each tick of the clock. His body was relaxed, his mind quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, Squidward didn't dread tomorrow. He didn't think about SpongeBob or Patrick or the Krusty Krab. He didn't even think about his great future or the things he thought he deserved but never had. All he thought about was now, and now was good. The chair creaked softly as Squidward shifted, pulling the blanket a little higher. His eyes drifted once more to the clarinet, still lying on the table under the lamp's glow. For years, that instrument had been a source of frustration, a reminder of dreams he could never quite reach. But tonight, it didn't feel like a burden. Tonight, it felt like a friend. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet wrap around him like another blanket. The faint hum of the ocean, the gentle tick of the clock, and the memory of his own soft melody seemed to merge into one. His breathing slowed, steady and calm, until it matched the rhythm of the sea outside. For once, there were no complaints, no bitterness, no noise, only the stillness of a man finally at peace with the moment. Squidward's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles as sleep tugged at him. And with that, Squidward tentacles, the reluctant dreamer of Bikini Bottom, drifted into a quiet, contented slumber. The night in Bikini Bottom stretched on, calm and steady like a slow tide that refused to rush. Squidward stirred faintly under his blanket, his eyelids fluttering before opening again. He hadn't meant to fall asleep in his chair, but the warmth of the lamp, the soft comfort of the cushion, and the lingering music of his clarinet had lulled him so easily. Now, as his eyes adjusted, he realized the silence of his home had deepened even more. The clock ticked softly, but the sound seemed quieter than before. Outside, the ocean rolled with the faintest whooshes, gentle as a lullaby. Squidward sat up slightly, stretching his long arms with a creak, his joints popping in protest. He groaned quietly, rubbing his forehead. "Typical," he muttered under his breath, his voice groggy. "Can't even nap in peace without waking up halfway through." Still, there was no frustration in his tone, only the matter-of-fact muttering of a man who'd gotten used to his own rhythms. He stood, carefully folding the blanket, then placed it neatly over the back of his chair. The lamp still glowed warmly, but the room had cooled slightly, as if the very air wanted him to notice the stillness pressing gently against his home. He wandered toward the window, peering out into the watery night. Across the way, SpongeBob's pineapple house was dark. No lights, no noise, no random bursts of laughter. Just the quiet silhouette of its spiky top under the faint glow of the ocean's natural luminescence. For a moment, Squidward blinked in disbelief. "Well, finally," he murmured. "Peace." And then, to his own surprise, he chuckled. Not a sarcastic, biting chuckle, but a light one. A sound that felt almost foreign leaving his mouth. The neighbors weren't awake. The town wasn't noisy, and the night belonged entirely to him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Squidward had no one else's chaos to contend with. He turned away from the window, his footsteps muffled against the rug. There was a strange comfort in the way his house sounded tonight, muted, soft, and cozy. The ticking clock, the faint hum of the lamp, and the occasional creak of his floorboards made a rhythm that felt almost like background music. Squidward glanced at his clarinet again, lying where he had left it. His instinct was to groan at the thought of playing again, but instead he hesitated. His hands itched faintly, not with the drive to practice or impress anyone, but with the simple curiosity of filling the silence with something of his own. He picked it up, this time handling it more gently than usual. Sitting back down, Squidward brought the instrument to his lips and blew a quiet, careful note. It was soft, hesitant, but warm, like the sound of a whisper breaking into the still air. He adjusted, then played another and another, stringing them together until the beginnings of a melody formed. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, it was simple, like a tune one hums to themselves while walking home on a cool evening. But in the stillness of the night, it sounded beautiful. Squidward closed his eyes, letting his long fingers move with slow certainty. The music rose and fell gently, weaving itself into the rhythm of the house around him. The clarinet sang softly, almost like a lullaby that Squidward was unknowingly playing for himself. Each note seemed to echo a feeling he rarely admitted he had. The desire for calm, the joy of stillness, and the quiet pride of creating something only for his own ears. Minutes passed, but it felt timeless. Squidward stopped only when his breathing told him he was tired again. He lowered the clarinet into his lap, the last note lingering in the air before dissolving into silence. He sighed, long and quiet, as though he had been holding in a weight all evening and had finally let it out. The night seemed to agree with him. The house, the ocean, even the faint shimmer of the water outside, all of it wrapped him in quiet approval. Squidward leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Not bad," he said softly to himself, though there was no one around to hear. "Not bad at all." And for once he meant it. The quiet settled back around him after the music, but this time it felt fuller, like the house had been warmed by the melody he'd just played. Squidward set his clarinet carefully on the table beside him, then rose to his feet with a deep stretch. His back gave a long crack, and he muttered, "Lovely," before padding softly into the kitchen. The tiled floor was cool under his feet, a small reminder that night had truly wrapped itself around Bikini Bottom. He opened his fridge with a low hum, the faint creak of the door echoing in the otherwise hushed kitchen. Inside there wasn't much, just the basics. But he wasn't really hungry. Instead, he pulled out a simple glass bottle of kelp tea and poured himself a small amount. The faint aroma rose up, earthy and calming. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth travel down his throat, soothing as a bedtime tune. Squidward leaned against the counter, staring absently at the bubbles that floated past his kitchen window. They drifted lazily in the water, glowing faintly under the moonlight that filtered through the ocean's surface. It wasn't fireworks, it wasn't excitement, but it was perfect in its own way. He exhaled through his nose, the kind of sigh that came with contentment rather than annoyance. It was rare for him. Rare enough that he noticed the difference in his own body. His shoulders weren't tight. His jaw wasn't clenched. He was, for once, at ease. Placing the glass aside, he wandered back into the living room. His eyes drifted toward his bookshelf. The spines of his carefully arranged novels, music theory guides, and art books lined up neatly, their covers catching the faint lamplight. He hadn't opened some of them in ages, always claiming he was too busy or too annoyed to bother. But tonight felt different. He slid one book from the shelf, the leather covers soft under his suctioned hands. Sitting down again, Squidward opened it to a random page. The smell of old paper tickled his nose, and he let out a small hum of appreciation. His eyes followed the lines of printed words, but it wasn't really the story that captured him. It was the experience itself, the weight of the book, the way the page crinkled softly as he turned it, the steady rhythm of reading in silence. Time passed without him realizing. The ocean outside whispered gently against the walls, and the lamp beside him glowed with a steady golden calm. Squidward shifted in his chair, utterly absorbed in the world before him. The words danced across his mind, not rushed, not forced, just flowing, like water trickling through a quiet stream. For once, he didn't feel the gnawing itch of comparison. He wasn't thinking about neighbors or critics or the constant noise of Bikini Bottom life. He wasn't worried about whether he was good enough at his clarinet or whether anyone cared about his art. None of it mattered. Here in this moment, Squidward was simply himself, unbothered, unmeasured, and free. He caught himself smiling faintly again, though it wasn't a grin. It was subtle, tucked into the corners of his mouth like a secret he didn't mind keeping. Eventually, his eyes grew heavy. He placed the bookmark gently inside the novel, closing it with the care of someone who knew they'd want to return to it. Setting it aside, he leaned back, staring toward the window. The ocean outside seemed to shift as he watched. The faint glow of drifting jellyfish caught his eye. Tiny lanterns bobbing through the night water. Their soft lights blinked in rhythm like stars floating just for him. He stared at them, entranced, as if the universe itself had decided to put on a private show for Squidward tentacles. "Not bad company," he whispered, almost amused. The jellyfish pulsed slowly, drifting in and out of view, their delicate bodies shimmering against the darkness. Squidward leaned his head on his hand, his eyelids drooping again. A quietness washed over him. Something deeper than silence. A kind of peace that touched even his usually cynical heart. It struck him then that nights like this didn't happen often. Maybe that's why they felt so precious when they did. No interruptions, no expectations, no noise. Just the hum of his own world, calm and steady. He sighed once more, soft and lingering. I could get used to this. The thought trailed off into the stillness, wrapping itself around the glow of the lamp, the shimmer of the jellyfish, and the steady rhythm of Squidward's heartbeat. Squidward stood up again, this time slower, savoring the movement, as though he were drifting in rhythm with the ocean itself. His house creaked gently in the current, and for once it wasn't a sound that irritated him. It was almost comforting, like a lullaby only the sea could provide. He moved over to the gramophone in the corner of the room. It was one of his prized possessions, though he didn't often share that fact. Lifting the lid carefully, he selected one of his old vinyl records. The sleeve was worn with age, corners curled slightly, but he knew the music inside was timeless. With a careful hand, he set the record down and lowered the needle. A soft crackle filled the room first, the kind of sound that felt nostalgic, warm, familiar. Then the music began. Slow, lilting notes of smooth jazz spilled into the air, blending effortlessly with the glow of the lamp and the sight of jellyfish still drifting past his window. Ah, Squidward sighed, lowering himself into his chair once again. He let the notes surround him, wrapping him in an invisible blanket. His eyes closed, and for a long moment, he just listened. The saxophone weaved a lazy melody, backed by the gentle rhythm of brushed drums. It wasn't grand or showy, it was simple, and that was enough. The corners of Squidward's mouth tugged upward again. He never laughed at loud jokes or wild antics, but here he was, smiling at nothing more than music and silence. Perhaps that was his kind of happiness, not big or loud, but quiet, steady, lingering. He reached for his tea once more, the cup still faintly warm, and took another sip. The liquid smoothed across his tongue, and he let out another hum of approval. Everything felt aligned, like his little world was exactly as it should be. Then a faint scratching sound broke the rhythm. Squidward's eyes snapped open, narrowing toward the window. His first thought, naturally, was SpongeBob or Patrick, sneaking around and planning some ridiculous nighttime adventure. His face twisted with preemptive annoyance. But when he leaned closer, squinting out into the dark water, he saw nothing but the drifting glow of jellyfish. No yellow sponge, no pink starfish, just the ocean's quiet. The scratching came again, softer this time, almost like the whisper of a current brushing against the coral walls. Squidward tilted his head, the corners of his eyes tightening. He considered ignoring it. It wasn't exactly unusual for the sea to make odd sounds, but curiosity tugged at him. He walked to the window, pressing a hand against the glass. Outside, the jellyfish continued their slow parade. Their lights shimmered faintly, painting pale blue streaks across the sand below. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow slip between them, something moving in the darker water. But when he blinked, it was gone. Probably nothing, Squidward muttered, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. He adjusted his nightcap and gave a small huff. Even the ocean wants to ruin my evening. Still, he sat back down, determined not to let some stray sound chase away his peace. The jazz played on rich and full, coaxing him back into calmness. His eyes drifted toward his easel in the corner. A half-finished painting stood there, broad strokes of deep blues and purples, something abstract he hadn't touched in weeks. He stared at it for a long moment, then pushed himself to his feet again. Grabbing a paintbrush, Squidward dipped it into the palette left beside the easel. The colors had dried a little, but he didn't care. He began to paint, the brush gliding across the canvas in steady motions. Each stroke matched the rhythm of the music. Long, smooth lines, small flicks of detail. He wasn't painting for anyone else, not this time. There was no gallery, no critic, no show. Just him, the canvas, and the quiet night. Minutes stretched into longer moments, each one more effortless than the last. The canvas grew more alive with every line, glowing softly under the lamplight. Squidward's breathing slowed, steady and calm. He didn't even notice when the record ended, the music fading back into the faint crackle of silence. When he finally stepped back, a brush still in hand, Squidward gazed at his work. It wasn't perfect, it never was, not in his eyes. But it was his. A swirl of blues and purples, accented with faint touches of white. Something about it reminded him of the jellyfish outside, drifting stars in an underwater sky. Not bad, he admitted quietly. The words felt strange on his tongue. Usually he was his own harshest critic, but tonight he allowed himself to simply appreciate what he'd made. He rinsed the brush, set it aside, and stood there for a while longer, staring at the painting. The house was still, the ocean calm. The scratching sound from earlier hadn't returned. It was just him and the hum of water outside. Maybe, Squidward whispered, tonight isn't so bad after all. And with that he returned to his chair, pulling a soft blanket across his lap. He leaned back, eyes fluttering closed as the gentle rhythm of the ocean filled the silence once again. The lamp flickered faintly as Squidward settled deeper into his chair. His eyelids grew heavy, the edges of the room blurring into softer shapes. He could hear the ocean shifting outside, not as a disruption, but as a steady lull, like the world itself was sighing with him. His gaze lingered once more on the painting, glowing faintly in the corner. A part of him wanted to stand, to add another stroke, but the warmth of the blanket kept him anchored. For once, he didn't fight it. Squidward let his head tilt back, his breathing slowing until it matched the hush of the sea. The jellyfish outside floated on, glowing gently against the glass. Their silent drift became the last thing he saw before his eyes closed fully. In that moment, the house was perfectly still. No laughter, no chaos, no interruptions. Just Squidward, resting at last, carried softly into dreams by the ocean's embrace. Squidward stirred awake as a gentle warmth stretched across his face. At first he groaned and yanked his blanket over his head. Ugh, morning already? Haven't I suffered enough? His voice was muffled, half asleep, and dripping with that familiar Squidward grumble. He lay there for a few moments, trying to convince himself he could go back to sleep. But the light leaking through the cracks of his curtains wasn't harsh or blinding the way mornings usually felt to him. It was soft, almost golden, spilling into his room like a slow spotlight. Reluctantly, Squidward peeked out from under the blanket, blinking at the glow. The room looked different, bathed in that light. His dresser, his nightstand, even his collection of self-portraits on the wall, all of it looked strangely peaceful. He rubbed his eyes, sat up with a stretch that made his joints creak, and muttered, "Well, it's not unbearable." For Squidward, that was practically a glowing review. He slid out of bed, tied his robe around his waist, and shuffled toward the window. Pulling the curtains aside, he was greeted with something he could hardly believe. Quiet. The kind of quiet he'd wished for his entire life. No SpongeBob bouncing outside. No Patrick slamming his rock shut. No squeals, no nonsense, no chaos. Just the gentle sway of kelp trees and the shimmer of sunlight scattering across the reef. "Finally," Squidward whispered, eyes narrowing in pleasant disbelief. "The world has finally learned to keep it down." It was almost too good to be true. He stood there for a while, soaking it in, before deciding that such a miraculous morning deserved to be savored properly. He trudged to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and brewed himself a hot cup of kelp tea. The smell alone was comforting, wrapping around him like a soft scarf. Carrying the cup carefully, Squidward stepped outside onto his porch. He sat in his usual chair, the one that always felt slightly too stiff, and sipped. The warmth traveled slowly down his throat, and the silence around him made the flavor feel richer, smoother. For once, his tea didn't taste like part of a routine. It tasted like an event. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and tapped his foot lazily on the wooden porch. In his mind, he imagined it wasn't just tapping, but keeping time with some elegant background music, perhaps even a string quartet playing in his honor. He could almost hear applause in the distance. He smirked, savoring the thought. After a while, Squidward's gaze drifted back to his house, where his clarinet case sat waiting by the window. Usually mornings were too loud or too stressful for him to play properly. Someone was always interrupting him, whether it was SpongeBob barging in or the town erupting in yet another ridiculous crisis. But this morning felt sacred, as if it belonged to him and him alone. Squidward mused, setting down his empty cup. Perhaps the world is finally ready for a concert worth hearing. He went back inside, opened the clarinet case with deliberate care, and polished the instrument until it gleamed. Holding it in his hand, Squidward felt the rare tingle of anticipation. He raised it to his lips and played a note. Soft, smooth, carried on the quiet air. Then another, and another. Soon a melody floated through his home, curling gently around the furniture and out through the open windows. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was calm, steady, and rich with emotion. Squidward closed his eyes as he played, allowing himself to drift into the rhythm. The notes seemed to sink into the ocean itself, and he almost imagined the water responding, echoing back his song. He pictured himself in a grand concert hall, seated under a spotlight, every ear fixed on his performance. The audience was silent, reverent, and completely in awe of him. Of course, the reality was just Squidward alone in his living room, but for once, he didn't care. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. In the rare silence of this morning, his clarinet sang purely for him, and that was enough. Squidward's fingers glided over the keys with more ease than they had in weeks. Normally, his practice was punctuated with interruptions, SpongeBob's eager knocks, Patrick's booming laughter, or the occasional jellyfish swarm bouncing against his window. But now the stillness let every note rise and fall in full, uninterrupted arcs. When the last phrase tapered off into silence, Squidward lowered his clarinet and breathed out a long sigh. "Beautiful," he whispered to himself, though his voice carried the familiar weight of self-critique. "Not flawless, but close enough. A masterpiece in this wasteland of noise." He set the clarinet gently back in its case and wandered toward his kitchen again. His stomach gave a polite rumble. Usually mornings meant hurried cereal or toast, snatched between sighs and muttered complaints. But today, Squidward felt oddly inspired. Perhaps this morning deserved something finer. Pulling open his cupboards, he gathered ingredients like a chef on a cooking show. Seaweed flakes, coral berries, and his prized jar of imported kelp jam. Humming faintly, something he rarely allowed himself to do, he whipped up a small but elegant breakfast. The coral berries he arranged on a plate like jewels. The toast he buttered with meticulous care, adding a swirl of jam as if composing a painting. Sitting back down at his little dining table, Squidward admired the spread. "Now this," he said, clasping his hands together, "is civilized living." Each bite tasted better than the last, though perhaps it was simply because there was no background chaos to ruin it. The world wasn't barging in with noise, no SpongeBob barging through the door with his relentless optimism, no Patrick stomping through the yard. Just Squidward, his breakfast, and the serene hum of the sea. He lingered over his meal, not rushing, letting the flavors linger on his tongue. By the time he cleared the plate, He felt something he hadn't experienced in a long while. Contentment. Pure, unshaken contentment. Stretching his arms, he shuffled back toward the porch. The morning light had shifted slightly, becoming softer as the sun climbed higher. The neighborhood still sat in silence, as though the whole world had pressed the pause button just for him. Squidward chuckled under his breath. I could get used to this. He decided to take a walk. Not the usual stomp of frustration he made when storming away from SpongeBob, but a leisurely stroll. He tied a scarf around his neck, more for the flair than the weather, and set off down the quiet street. With each step, he noticed details he usually ignored: the faint sway of kelp fronds in the current, the shimmer of shells scattered across the sand, even the distant hum of small fish darting by. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was calm. Calm enough for Squidward to imagine he was living in a different town altogether, a better one, a quieter one. As he walked past SpongeBob's pineapple, Squidward stopped. It stood perfectly still, its windows shut, its yard untouched. Normally, SpongeBob would be watering the grass, humming loudly, or practicing his bubble-blowing techniques at this hour. But today, nothing. Squidward leaned closer, peering at the door. Probably overslept. Or finally learned the art of peace. He smirked at the thought, though a tiny flicker of curiosity tugged at him. Still, he pushed on. He wasn't about to waste his perfect morning wondering what nonsense SpongeBob and Patrick were up to. This was his time. By the time he reached the edge of the reef, Squidward found a flat rock to sit on. He lowered himself carefully and gazed out at the open sea. The water was crystal clear, sunlight dappling through in golden ribbons. Schools of fish glided by, darting like brushstrokes across a canvas. For a long while, he simply sat there, breathing slowly, watching the scene unfold as if the ocean were putting on a private show just for him. The thought made his chest swell, and though he'd never admit it aloud, his eyes softened. He closed them for a moment, imagining himself in a painter's studio, immortalizing the view on canvas. Each shimmer of light would be a delicate stroke, each ripple a perfect blend of color. For once, his imagination didn't make him scoff, it actually made him smile. "Not bad," he muttered, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. The breeze underwater was faint but cool, carrying with it the soft fragrance of seaweed blooms drifting somewhere nearby. Squidward adjusted his scarf with an air of sophistication, as if he were attending an outdoor cafe instead of merely sitting on a rock by the reef. He sat there longer than he expected, caught in the quiet rhythm of the ocean. Every so often, he closed his eyes, letting the sound of distant waves seep into his thoughts like a lullaby. When he opened them again, he noticed something else. His mind wasn't racing. Normally, his thoughts were filled with complaints. SpongeBob's laughter ringing in his ears, the memory of Mr. Krabs hollering orders, or the nagging dread of another wasted day. But now, nothing. Just stillness. "Remarkable," Squidward said, clasping his hands together dramatically. "Truly remarkable. The silence is refreshing. Therapeutic, even." He straightened his back and let out a pleased sigh. For once, he didn't feel like a bystander to someone else's nonsense. This morning was his, and his alone. After some time, Squidward rose from the rock and continued walking further along the reef. His steps echoed faintly across the sandy floor, but otherwise there was no noise. The deeper he walked into the neighborhood's outskirts, the more surreal the calm became. Coral towers stood like sculptures. Kelp drifted lazily, and the water shimmered with a kind of golden glow. It was almost too perfect. Squidward paused mid-step, his brow furrowing. "Strange," he muttered. "Where is everybody? Normally by now I'd hear at least one boat motor, one neighbor yelling about their sea snail chewing the drapes, Something. His gaze drifted back toward Bikini Bottom, where SpongeBob's pineapple, Patrick's rock, and his own Easter Island head sat in eerie stillness. Nothing moved. No shadows in the windows, no bubbles rising, no clatter of doors or chatter. He tapped his chin thoughtfully. Well, it's not my business. If they all want to disappear for a day, that's fine by me. Finally, peace and quiet. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice echoed strangely in the water, swallowed almost immediately by the silence. That tiny flicker of unease crept back into his chest. Still, he shook his head, forcing a smile. Don't be ridiculous, Squidward. You've been begging for this kind of morning for years. You're not going to spoil it by overthinking. With that, he turned and made his way back home. When he arrived, the familiar shape of his house stood tall and motionless, its stone face somehow sterner than usual. Squidward placed his hands on his hips and admired it. Ah, finally. A proper home for a refined cephalopod. Stepping inside, he immediately felt comforted by the familiar interior. His easel stood in the corner, blank canvas waiting. His record player rested neatly on its table, a stack of vinyls beside it. Everything was exactly where it belonged, just as it should be. Squidward moved to the easel, picked up a brush, and dipped it in his palette. The view of the reef still lingered in his mind, and he decided to capture it before the memory faded. Each stroke was deliberate, careful, his tentacles steady as he pulled colors across the canvas. The golden light of the sea, the swaying kelp, the shimmering schools of fish, it all began to take shape. He paused to tilt his head at the painting. Not bad. Not perfect, but better than the last dozen attempts. Pleased with himself, he set the brush down and turned toward the record player. Perhaps a little music will add to the atmosphere. He placed a vinyl on the turntable and lowered the needle. A soft, jazzy tune began to drift through the house, curling around him like smoke. Squidward swayed slightly, closing his eyes as the clarinet solo filled the air. The sound was rich, smooth, and hauntingly beautiful. This, Squidward murmured, is culture. For a moment, everything aligned. The quiet neighborhood outside, the gentle music inside, the fresh memory of his walk, and the satisfaction of his painting. It was, in his opinion, the kind of morning worth remembering. Yet as he stood there soaking it all in, he couldn't help noticing one thing. The silence outside was absolute. No muffled voices, no bubbles, no sound at all except the record spinning. And for the first time since the morning began, Squidward frowned. Squidward tapped his foot to the rhythm of the clarinet solo, but his frown lingered. The music was wonderful, yes, but the oppressive quiet outside pressed against his walls like a heavy blanket. Normally, even the faintest hint of SpongeBob's giggles or Patrick's mumbling would worm their way into his house by now. He set the clarinet record aside and muttered, "Perhaps I should just step outside again. No reason to let myself grow paranoid in the middle of a perfectly good morning." With an exaggerated sigh, he slid open his front door. The sunlight underwater glowed as golden as before, but the stillness was unchanged. His eyes swept left. SpongeBob's pineapple looked undisturbed. Not a bubble, not a ripple. Then right, Patrick's rock was as still as carved coral. "Odd," Squidward whispered. "They're usually loud by now. SpongeBob, at the very least, should be bouncing around ready to ruin my day." He took a cautious step onto the path in front of his house, glancing between the two homes. The longer he stared, the more surreal the neighborhood appeared. The houses seemed less like homes and more like set pieces. Painted backdrops in a play where the actors had forgotten their lines. Squidward shivered and quickly retreated indoors. Closing the door with a firm push, he leaned against it, clutching his chest. "Get a grip, Squidward. You wanted quiet, and now you got it." Don't start imagining nonsense. To distract himself, he returned to his painting. The strokes of his brush felt comforting, steady. Each splash of color on the canvas kept him anchored, gave his thoughts something tangible to hold on to. He painted the coral reefs again, this time exaggerating the golden light so it shone even brighter than reality. Still, his eyes flicked toward the window every few minutes. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. Finally, he dropped the brush onto the palette with a groan. Fine. If no one else is going to ruin the piece, I'll enjoy it myself properly. He grabbed his clarinet from its stand, giving it a careful polish before lifting it to his mouth. The first notes drifted smoothly through the air, a low, velvety melody that made his chest swell with pride. His tentacles moved instinctively, guiding the clarinet through scales and improvisations. "Oh, listen to that tone," Squidward whispered between notes. "This is artistry. This is brilliance." The music filled every corner of his home, swirling around like a warm embrace. For a while, it drowned out his unease. He closed his eyes and imagined himself on stage, spotlight gleaming, audience applauding. Every note earned a standing ovation in his mind. But when he opened his eyes, the fantasy dissolved. His living room stared back at him in silence. No audience, no clapping, just stillness. The realization landed heavier than he expected. "So what if it's quiet?" he said aloud, trying to sound defiant. "At least there's no one here to ruin my performance." Yet his voice wavered at the end, betraying him. He placed the clarinet back on its stand and rubbed his temples. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was suffocating. He drifted to the window once more and peeked outside. The neighborhood was exactly the same, unmoving, untouched, unreal. A faint shiver ran down his arms. "Perhaps," Squidward whispered, "I should check. Just once, to prove nothing's wrong." Against his better judgment, he marched outside again, this time toward SpongeBob's pineapple. The exterior was bright and cheery as always, but when Squidward knocked on the door, the sound was strangely dull, swallowed up instantly by the water. No answer. He knocked again, harder. "SpongeBob, don't tell me you're sleeping in. It's not like you." Still nothing. Squidward pressed his ear against the pineapple. Silence. Not even the faintest creak of floorboards inside. He frowned, tugged at the handle, and found it unlocked. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by faint beams of sunlight filtering through the round windows. Furniture stood in its usual places. The armchair, the bookshelf, the little table, with seashell decorations. But everything was frozen. Not a sound. Not a trace of SpongeBob. Squidward's voice quivered as he whispered, "Empty." The word echoed oddly through the house, though it came back softer, like it was being smothered by something unseen. Squidward stepped back, shut the door firmly, and stood trembling on the path. The silence suddenly felt like a presence, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was waiting. And Squidward realized, with a sinking feeling, that the quiet he had wished for wasn't natural at all. Squidward staggered back to his own house, muttering under his breath, No, I am not doing this. I am not getting wrapped up in some bizarre mystery. SpongeBob's probably out jellyfishing. Yes, that's it. He's out with his net, annoying the jellyfish instead of me. Perfectly logical. But his voice cracked with each word, as if even he didn't believe it. He closed the door behind him and leaned on it again, pressing his forehead to the wood. His house, normally a haven, from the chaos of the neighborhood, now felt like a cage. The silence followed him inside, clinging to the walls, filling the spaces between his breaths. Squidward moved quickly to the clarinet stand, snatching up his instrument like a lifeline. He blew into it, letting out a long, trembling note. It wavered at first, shaky and unsure, then steadied into something more confident. He poured himself into the music, desperate to push the quiet away. The sound bounced through the room, rich and vibrant, and for a moment he could almost convince himself everything was fine. Almost. But as he played, something began to gnaw at him. The echoes didn't come back right. They didn't dance around the room as they usually did. Instead, it felt like the sound was being swallowed, dampened, as though the air itself was greedy for it. Squidward stopped mid-note, frozen. The silence that rushed in after was worse than before, thicker, like a heavy curtain dropping. He lowered the clarinet slowly and whispered, "This is insane. I'm insane." He sat on the couch, curling his arms around himself. "Maybe I need rest. That's it. A nap. That'll clear things up." But when he lay down, he couldn't relax. The ticking of the clock on his wall was absent. His eyes flicked open, and he realized it wasn't ticking at all. The hands hadn't moved since he last checked. Squidward's heart sank. "That's not possible." He rushed over and tapped the clock. No response. He gave it a shake. The hands remained frozen, pointing to a meaningless hour. He quickly checked the kitchen timer, then the little alarm clock by his bed. Both were still, as though time itself had grown weary of moving. His breathing grew sharp and uneven. No, this is ridiculous. Clocks break all the time, and that's all this is, just broken clocks. But even as he tried to rationalize it, the silence pressed harder. It wasn't simply stillness anymore. It was suffocation, and it was everywhere. Squidward returned to his window, desperate for any sign of movement, anything alive. The houses stood where they always had, untouched. The sand streets were empty. Not a jellyfish floated in the distance. Not a single ripple stirred the water. It was as if Bikini Bottom had fallen asleep and left him awake, stranded in a frozen dream. His knees wobbled, and he collapsed into his armchair, gripping the edges so tightly his tentacles trembled. "I wanted peace," he whispered, voice cracking. "But not like this. Not like this." The words echoed in his house, and for the first time all morning came back just a little louder. Not natural echo, something else. A faint repetition, like the silence itself had borrowed his voice. Squidward's blood ran cold. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He only stared into the dim room, waiting. And the silence waited back. Even in Bikini Bottom, peace can be found in the little moments, the sound of the ocean, the comfort of routine, and the joy of simply being still. May this story bring you calm and sweet dreams. Good night, sleepyheads.